As the Syrian civil war grinds into its third year, there are growing fears the violence is spreading. Last month, the Lebanese Shia Muslim group Hezbollah admitted sending its fighters across the border to battle the mainly Sunni Muslim rebels inside Syria. But this has raised sectarian tensions back in Lebanon to crisis levels.
ما يقوم به حزب الله في سوريا هو عين الفتنة تحت أي شعار وضعه.
الله يهدي هالوضع، الله إن شاء الله نحن كلياتنا بنحب بعضنا، كلياتنا إسلام.
Communities are arming themselves in preparation for the coming storm.
عادي هيك كلاشينات اليوم 1600.
Lebanon, once seen as one of the world's premier holiday destinations, is now teetering on the brink of disaster. I'm Abou-Zeid. I was born and grew up here in Lebanon. Back then, the country was fighting a vicious civil war, mainly between Christians and Muslims. It lasted almost 15 years. Since then, Lebanon's rebuilt itself. The capital, Beirut, is seen once more as the Paris of the Middle East. But now the civil war in next-door Syria is spilling over the borders and threatening to plunge Lebanon into chaos again. This time, the divide is between Sunni Muslims, who mainly support the Syrian rebels, and Shia Muslims who mostly back the Syrian government in the capital Damascus. Sectarian violence between followers of Islam is the nightmare vision for the Middle East. Lebanon is located in a dangerous region. Bordered by Syria and Israel, it has frequently been caught up in the politics and violence of its more powerful neighbors. This time round, things are no different. This is the frontier town of Al-Qusayr in Syria. Until recently, it was a rebel stronghold, attracting anti-Assad Islamic militants from across the Muslim world. Today, it's a ghost town, devastated and abandoned. Behind me is the administrative directorate of the district of Qusayr. It stands witness to the destruction that this area has seen. In June this year, the Syrian regime launched a successful attack to recapture Qusayr from the rebels. Alongside government troops were well-trained fighters from the Lebanese Shia Muslim organization Hezbollah. Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah said fighting Syrian rebels was a new chapter for his organization, which had originally been configured for confronting Israel.
لن تستطيعوا أن تسقطوا دمشق.
Some of Qusayr's remaining locals say that under the rebels, their town had become a magnet for foreign jihadists, Islamic militants who believe in fighting a global holy war. And so they appreciate Hezbollah's involvement in helping to win the battle.
بعد 4 أشهر بدأ الحراك. كان أول شيء سلمي وصيحات وهتافات وشعارات، إلا أنه تطور هالشيء وقاموا بنهب وسرق وحرق، لأنه هناك من جاء الشيشاني ومن جاء حتى اليوغوسلاف، حتى المسيحي من الغرب جاء وقاتل. طبعا هلا وجود عناصر حزب الله في منطقة القصير هي أتت لدعم القوة أو قوة الجيش حتى ننتهي من هذه العصابات المجرمة.
The rebels were routed, But the undisguised intervention of Hezbollah's Shia Muslim fighters had caused a sectarian backlash back across the border here in Lebanon.
Assalamu alaikum.
These Syrian refugees came from Qusayr. Following the battle, they fled for their lives and now live in squalor just inside Lebanon's northern border. They're furious with Hezbollah for intervening in Syria.
والله بنكون عم ناكل ما بنشوف غير الضرب اجانا وانا حرمي اشهد الله ختيار ظهري معاي دستك واجراني بيوجعوني صرنا نركض يشحطوني شحط الاولاد والله العظيم يوم جينا يشحطوني شحط قلت يا عمي دشروني خليني اموت على الدرب.
Her son Abdul Karim was a rebel fighter in Qusayr. He used to admire Hezbollah for resisting Israel, but now sees their involvement in Syria as a betrayal.
كنا عايشين نحن ايام كنا جيران واهل نشتري منهم وعاملين فرن خبز بيننا وبينهم بناخذ منهم وبياخذوا منا وحتى نحن متجوزين منهم يعني نحن اخذين من الشيعة عم هوات ما عانينا وحرقوا قلوبنا وما عملوا بالنسوان وما ذبحوا منا يمكن لاخر حياتنا نحاول نتصالح مع حزب الله مستحيل باي طريقة.
Driving along next to the border, I could see smoke rising from the Syrian side. The government forces were shelling targets just a few miles away. There would, no doubt, be more dead and more refugees as a result. But both sides in this conflict are paying a heavy price. This is the town of Hermel in the Bekaa Valley in eastern Lebanon. It's a couple of miles away from the Syrian borders. Ala was in his 20s when he died fighting for Hezbollah in Qusayr. These posters commemorating his death are new. His brother consoles himself with the idea that Ala paid the ultimate price so that the rest of his community wouldn't have to.
بالعكس هيدي المعركة معركتنا لأنه لو مع الشباب الطيبة هاي وهاي الشهداء اللي عم تنزل كانوا عنا هون كانوا عنا هلا كانوا بين بيوتنا وعم يسمونا
ولا للحظة بتحس إنه هالخسارة كانت خسارة عبثية ولا لحظة بتمرق
لا مش خسارة عبثية اللي بيمشي على خط أبو عبد الله الحسين ما بنعدها خسارة بالعكس هيدا فخر لنا هيدا فخر.
Hezbollah call their dead martyrs and bestow great honor on their families. But whatever the party line is, the overwhelming emotions I sensed when visiting this household were grief, loss, and shock.
كان يقعد هنا يأرجل ونقعد كلنا حواليه هون. شو بدنا نحكي بعد؟
بلا بك.
Hezbollah fighters are very secretive and usually never speak to the media. But after extensive negotiations with our contacts, I met one who had fought in Qusayr and was prepared to talk as long as we hid his identity. He said Qusayr was a bitter struggle.
اللي كنا عم نقاتله بالقصير عدو شرس منه هين مارق على أفغانستان والشيشان البوسنة الهرسك ليبيا العراق وين ما بدك مارق في مشروع مقاومة عم بيحاولوا ينهوه بالمنطقة طلع حزب الله على القصير ولا بده يطلع على حلب ولا على بغداد هيدا مشروع مقاومة بدنا نحميه بدمنا لأن هيدا المشروع انعمل بالدم والشهداء والجرحى.
Ever since Hezbollah joined in the fighting in Syria, the war there has hit home in Lebanon in other ways too. Syrian rebels have been firing artillery rockets into Lebanese territory in revenge for Hezbollah's military intervention. This clip from YouTube allegedly shows them in action.
عاشت سوريا حرة أبية
I was taken by Hezbollah to the site of what they said was a rocket strike near the Lebanese town of Hermel in the Bekaa Valley. This olive grove had been set on fire by a rocket strike, and they said other strikes have killed people, including a young woman called Lulu. Lulu's father told me he holds Sunni extremists responsible for the death of his daughter. As a result, he strongly backs Hezbollah's continued involvement in Syria.
هيدي الناس الكفرة القاعدة والحر وما شابه ذلك. هيدي الناس لا بتعرف بالإسلام، لا بتعرف بالمسيحية، لا بتعرف باليهودية. نحن كإسلام أنا اليوم بفضل اليهودي عليها هاي الناس لسبب واحد، إنه اليهودي إذا لقى عدوه مجروح قدامه بيشيلوا بيسعفوا بيحكموا وبعدين بيحاكموا. هيدي الناس لا، بتلاقي المسيحي بتلاقي المسلم بتلاقي اليهودي بتشقفوا وبتاكل من لحمه. يعني هيدي الناس بتقول إنه أنا ولا أحد تاني بعدي.
Tensions across the Bekaa Valley are very high, but the Shia Muslims here have multiple loyalties. While most are Hezbollah supporters, they are also affiliated to powerful tribes and clans in the area, many of whom have been feuding with local Sunni Muslims for years. Just how volatile things can get became apparent when we tried to film the funeral procession of a Hezbollah supporter who had died of wounds he'd suffered in Al-Qusayr. Despite being told it would be okay to take pictures, things turned ugly and our cameraman was attacked.
No, I didn't film faces.
Some of the gunmen during the procession jumped out of their car, roughed up the cameraman and stopped us filming and took one of our memory cards. If anything, this shows how tense this area can be. Things are looking grim in the north of Lebanon too. My next destination was the coastal city of Tripoli. It's a place that has seen a constant stream of armed clashes that actually predate the war in Syria itself. Most of Tripoli's population are Sunni Muslims and supporters of Syria's rebels, but 50,000 Alawites, an offshoot of Shia Islam, are crammed onto a hilltop community called Jabal Muhsin. They are loyal to the regime in Damascus. We are now driving on the front line between two warring communities. To one side here, there's Jabal Muhsin, predominantly Alawites. To the other, there's Bab al-Tibbani, a majority of Sunni inhabitants. This street here is called Syria Street, and ironically, Syria has become the one issue that is dividing the Lebanese. And this is what it looks like when the Sunnis and Alawites of Tripoli go to war. The Sunni gunmen in Bab al-Tibbani shoot uphill. The Alawites, who support Bashar al-Assad, shoot downwards. Stuck in between, unarmed civilians and a hapless Lebanese army who was supposed to keep the peace. My guide in the Sunni district of Bab al-Tibbani was Sheikh Bilal al-Masri, a local street preacher and a gunman who runs his own mini militia. Sheikh Bilal blames Assad supporters and Hezbollah for all the violence in his city.
من يحكم لبنان هو تابع للنظام السوري الإيراني، أي تابع لبشار الأسد وتابع للنظام الإيراني، فيجعل من باب التباني وجبل محسن محرقة ومقر سائل.
ترفضون بالمقابل أن يكون الاقتتال ذو وجه طائفي مذهبي، تتمسكون بهذه المقولة. هؤلاء من أهل السنة.
هذا حقيقة لبنان، هذا حقيقة.
إذن الصراع مذهبي طائفي.
الصراع يحول مذهبي. من الذي يقتل ومن أي فئة من اللبنانيين؟ نحن مع العيش المشترك، مع أن وعشنا فترة طويلة في السابق وفي الحاضر مع بقية الطوائف، ولكن عندما نرى أن فئة من الناس هي الفئة النصيرية والفئة الشيعية الصفوية تقتل أهل السنة تخصهم بالذات، ماذا سنقول؟ نقول نحن أهل السنة نقتل، وهذه حقيقة الأمر.
The rise in sectarianism is affecting a whole generation. Abu Khalid, the neighborhood juice and coffee vendor, said his own son was falling into ever more extremist ideology.
يا اخي هاي الشباب اللي عمره 16 17 سنه 18 سنه اول شيء نشأته عم بيحط على المستقبل، عم بيحط على الجزيره، عم بيحط على العربيه، عم بيحط على اذاعه الجيش الحر، عم بيحط على كذا اذاعه يعني تبعون الثوره. يعني انا مثلا عندي شاب عمره 19 سنه ما عم بقدر كيفه، ما عم بقدر كابي روح يا ابي في موت في ليش عم بيقتلوا هن وانا بدي اعمل وانا بدي اقتلك يا بابا يا حبيبي.
On the other side of Syria Street, up on Jabal Muhsin, the pro-Assad Alawite community mirror their neighbors' fears. Abu Rami has been a militia fighter since the 1970s and well knows Lebanon's nasty little wars. He sees things only getting worse.
أنا بقول لك يمكن الحرب اللبنانية تبلش من جبل مسين وتشمل الشرق الأوسط كله. واردة. يعني حتى هلا اللعبات اللي عم يلعبوها من صيدا ومن امبارح صار اشتباك بالبلد. يعني جماعة محسوبين على حزب الله ما بدهم. يعني عم يحاولوا صراع هن يا ضدنا يا معنا. إذا بتقلي من تجارب من خبرة بقول لك الصراع ممكن يمتد. إذا ما لجمت الأمور ممكن نشوف حرب دموية بالشرق الأوسط كله.
Many of Tripoli's poorest communities are under arms. Street posters commemorate the fallen on both sides. Fighting your neighbors has become a way of life here. These gunmen might look intimidating, but they are masked simply to protect their identities. They are ordinary men with normal jobs and families at home. But many local men feel they have no option but to pick up arms to defend their communities, because the forces of law and order seemingly cannot do so. It's a vicious circle. This is one of the many front lines between two warring communities. And for somebody like me who has lived throughout so many years of war during the civil war in Lebanon, it's all coming back, and it truly feels scary. Suddenly, we learned from Twitter that more clashes had broken out in Tripoli, this time in a completely different part of the city. The instability was clearly spreading. A local man offered to guide us into the combat zone.
It's like two militias in Tripoli. One of them is for Hezbollah and the other is for the Syrian revolution. They are fighting inside the old souks of Tripoli.
Normally busy streets were empty, as locals watched anxiously from the edges of the firefight.
ما بعرف مين عم يعمل حرب يا أخي. الله يهدي هالوضع. الله إن شاء الله نحن كلياتنا بنحب بعضنا كلياتنا إسلام.
In the end, our guide told us it was too dangerous to proceed.
Don't take it.
Instead, the Lebanese army put on a show of strength, and they managed to contain the trouble, at least for a time. But things were also hotting up across the country. In the southern Lebanese city of Sidon, a Sunni Islamist group were holding a rally and concert in aid of the Syrian rebels. Saida is my city. This is the city where I grew up. 30-odd years ago, this city for me was the melting pot of all religious communities living together. I went to school with Druze, Christians, Muslims, Sunni and Shias. But this is the first time I see one particular religious group being able to rally so many people to support the cause of the Syrian revolution and raise money for them. But maybe in those years, something has changed in the city. Speakers denounced Hezbollah and singers sang in praise of the Syrian rebels. One of the organizers summed up the feelings of many here It was Hezbollah's involvement in Syria that was militarizing and mobilizing Lebanon's Sunni community.
ما يقوم به حزب الله في سوريا هو عين الفتنة تحت أي شعار وضعه. نحن منذ بداية الثورة قلنا فلننأى بأنفسنا عما يحصل في داخل سوريا، وليؤيد منا من يشاء ولكن دون التدخل الميداني. فتدخل حزب الله بهذا الشكل السافر وبحجج واهية في الأزمة السورية انعكس وللأسف بعدا مذهبيا هنا في لبنان.
But there were far more extreme elements present in the city. Sidon was also where I caught up with this man, Sheikh Ahmed al-Asir, an outspoken anti-Hezbollah Sunni cleric. When I met him, he told me his mosque was being spied on and threatened by Hezbollah agents based in some nearby flats. And so he had to go everywhere with armed bodyguards.
دخل لبنان في المعركة، والمقص كان الإعلان الحرب اللي أعلنوا يعني نصر الله بقوله دخلنا في مرحلة جديدة. هذا القول يمكن ربما كثير من السياسيين لم يتوقف عنده. الرجل كان صادق فيما يقول، قال دخلنا في مرحلة جديدة وأدخل الآلاف إلى سوريا.
كيف تقرؤون هذه المرحلة الجديدة؟
إعلان حرب على الطائفة السنية بأكملها في العالم الإسلامي.
Sheikh Asir was predicting catastrophe, but it turned out he knew something the rest of us didn't. 1 week after giving this interview, Asir's gunmen attacked the Lebanese army in Sidon. Asir took to social media, calling on his followers to help defend his people and mosque.
إلى كل المناصرين نحن عم نتعرض لاعتداء من الجيش اللبناني اللي هو الإيراني الطائفي المذهبي ومن شبيحة حسن نصر الله.
And Sidon turned into a war zone. After 2 days of heavy fighting, at least 18 Lebanese soldiers had been killed, along with about 40 of Asir's gunmen. Asir himself was on the run. His mosque was destroyed and the country was looking closer than ever to a renewed civil war. But Hezbollah supporters say their side does not want fighting in Lebanon.
يلي عم نحكى انه كسنة والشيعة لا سمح الله انه بده يصير في مشاكل. سني شيعي بدها طرف ولا طرفين؟ بدها طرفين. مزبوط؟ الطرف الثاني ما بده فتنة لو شو ما صار.
اللي هو
حزب الله اللي هو طائفة الشيعية. لو مهما كلفت، هيدا كلام الأمين العام مش كلامي.
I've seen what can happen when sectarianism is used to mobilize and control communities. Volatile, passionate situations can easily spin out of control. And Lebanon is a heavily armed society. Many people have access to guns and heavier weapons, and it's easy to obtain more. We're on our way to meet an arms dealer somewhere in Beirut. This is extremely high risk, but for as long as there is demand, there will always be people like him to provide the supply. مين عادة اللي بيطلب يشتري منك؟ مين زباينك يعني مين هن؟
عادي اللبنانية كلياتهم، الشعب اللبناني.
طيب وشو مبرر؟
كل واحد بده يحمي نفسه وخايف على حاله، لأن الدولة ما عادش فيها تحمي حدا اليوم. وتعرف حرب طائفية صايرة. عادي هيك كلاشينات اليوم 1600، مسدسات مثلا 14 2300، القنبلة ب50,000.
وهذا قاذفة ار بي جي.
قاذفة ار بي جي حقها 1200.
طيب المستخدم الشخصي شو بده بقاذفة الار بي جي؟
هيدا سلاح بكمل بعضه، اللي بيحمي نفسه بيشتري كل شيء.
ما بتحس انك عم بتساهم بزيادة؟
إذا أنا ما بعته غيري ببيع.
Lebanon has always been victim to regional politics and Syria, the country's biggest neighbor, remains key to Lebanon's fate. And the civil war there is casting its shadow across the entire Middle East. As the same sun sets over Beirut and to the east of Al-Qusayr, the Lebanese are nervously left wondering whether the sectarian fallout from the battles across the border will tip their country once more into the abyss.